Welcome back, Bill Shead.
Thank you, Terry.
And John Perrin,
Thank
welcome
you, Terry.
back.
Thank you.
We talked earlier about the relationship that evolved between Chief Peguis, the four other chiefs, Lord Selkirk, and the settlers, and the implications for the settlers. But if you would talk about the bigger picture, the Selkirk Treaty had implications for the churches, for the boundary of Canada. Tell me, first of all, about Selkirk's approach to dealing with the churches here.
Well, the first thing Selkirk had to do was to come to an agreement with the Indigenous people, because until he did that, he wouldn't be able to really allocate any land to the settlers or to the churches, which he did do. He allocated the area roughly from where St. John's Cathedral is now, right north to as far as Chief Peguis Trail in today's terms. And he went in further and gave the churches lands so that the Roman Catholics were able to establish the Archdiocese of St. Boniface, thank you, and the Anglicans established the Diocese of Rupert's Land. Now, he would not have been able to do that and still keep his obligation to the Crown of treating with the Indians. So having done that first, gave him the, I wouldn't say the authority, but gave him the comfort that he could look after the needs of the church and the settlers within the context of his agreement with the First Nations.
So John Perrin, what were the implications outside of Red River for the signing of this treaty? What did it do for, well, we didn't even have a nation of Canada at this point. It was still 50 years away, but what were the implications in that context?
Well, the implication for Canada really, I think, maybe came later through the successful establishment of a settlement here, which had that not been the case, we might well have had a very different outcome in the late part of the 1860s and early 1870s.
Why do you say that?
Well, because the Americans, for a long time after the Civil War, President Ulysses S. Grant had a declared policy of annexing Canada, and they attempted skirmishes into eastern Canada at different times in the period after the Civil War, and they had their eye on the West. In 1867, when Canada was confederated, the Americans also purchased Alaska from Russia. And it doesn't take too much of a leap of imagination to think that they were trying to create a foothold in the northern part of North America above the 49th parallel, which had already been agreed upon as the boundary. And they had an idea that if they could seize the Northwest, they could realize their national goal of manifest destiny of governing all of North America. So this settlement as an outpost of Canadian and British civilization was a bulwark against the Americans, and it actually turned out to in fact fulfill that function at the time of in the 1869-70 period after Confederation, when Canada wanted to come to the Northwest, and there was an understandable disagreement about the protection of land rights and so on, which is what Louis Riel was fighting for. But at the end of the day, Canada, this part of the country may have slipped out of Canada's grasp, but for this stable settlement that had been here at that point for 50 years.
Yeah. Now, the first settlers came in 1812. Why was Chief Peguis and his people, why were they so generous and helpful to the settlers, particularly when the settlers fell on hard times, Bill?
I can see a few motivations. I tend to look at the one that he really wanted peace. He didn't want to have a fight on his hands. And I think by treating people as visitors, and he was a host and he had an obligation to look after their welfare, I think that was the major obligation that he felt he had. I think there was another underlying reason too, and that was if there was a successful community between him and his traditional enemy in the south, he'd have a buffer. A little bit altruistic, I don't know. But I could be wrong on that one.
What did Peguis and his people do to help the settlers?
Well, when the fur traders were moving them out, they gave them shelter and fed them and helped them between seasons when their harvests were burned by the fur traders. And some of them that wanted to leave, he made sure that they got to the coast safely up to Fort York. There was one other thought that occurred to me, and it escapes me at the moment. I must be getting too damn.
I was going to say I can add to that as well, because when the first settlers arrived here in 1813, the preparations had not been made. In other words, the logistical support for the new settlement hadn't really fallen into place, and so there was no shelter, no food, and so Peguis helped to guide them down to Pembina, North Dakota, to Fort Pembina, and help them overwinter down there, because they would have starved and frozen to death if they'd stayed here. Then when they came back following summer, they aided them with food supplies again. They made sure they had pemmican and so on. They really without Peguis' support, the settlement simply would not have succeeded. That plaque over there on the Scots Monument states that. And it's been well understood. You can ask anybody who is a descendant of the original settlers, the Lord Selkirk Association of Rupert's Land, and they will tell you the same story, that without Peguis, the settlement simply would have perished. But at the time the Troubles broke out, the fighting broke out in 1816, the Seven Oaks Massacre. It was Peguis who put a halt to the violence. After the initial killings, the fur traders, the Northwest Company fur traders, really had it in their plan to eliminate all the settlers, either to kill them or drive them away. And Peguis prevented it. Now that prevented more killing. It wasn't that the settlers hung around. They did run away, but they had a chance to run away thanks to Peguis. The other thing that Peguis did was the morning after the massacre, where the bodies were lying around mutilated on the plain, it was Peguis and his men who went and recovered the bodies and brought them back here to Fort Douglas for burial. Peguis did that. This was a really profoundly strong relationship that Peguis had with the Scots and with and really my own view is, and Bill may not see it this way, but my own view is that because Peguis himself came from northwestern Ontario, and so he would have been familiar with the Royal Proclamation of 1763, because it was ratified by a couple of thousand chiefs in the Treaty of Niagara in 1764. And so all of the chiefs in all of the First Nations around the Great Lakes were party to that in effect, what was a ratification of the Royal Proclamation, including
Peguis.
Well, no, I don't. Peguis might not even have been born at the time, but certainly his community would have been aware of that history. And I think that somewhere in the collective consciousness of First Nations, some of them at least made decisions that they would rather deal with the British Crown going forward than deal with the post-American Revolution situation in the United States, because as we all know, I think the number I read is by 1870, the U.S. government was spending $20 million a year on the Indian Wars in the United States, when the entire budget of Canada was $19 million. So you can only imagine what was going on down there, and that scenario never happened in Canada. I'm not saying that the First Nations people in Canada were always treated properly or justly, and in fact we know full well they weren't, especially after the numbered treaties and so on. But the fact is, it was a different environment, and so I think Peguis would have seen perhaps some better outcome for his own people. I mean, clearly he was thinking about his people. His will stated, and I wish I had the precise quote, but in his will he stated that he had tried to do his best both for his own people and for white people in his life, and he hoped that his story would be told so that his family could appreciate how he'd lived his life.
Yes, he was a peaceful man. He wanted peace. He never chose sides in any of the physical confrontations between the settlers and the fur traders. In fact, he probably went for the underdog more than anything else. But it's very interesting when you look at the letter of introduction that Lord Selkirk gave Chief Peguis. The closing line says he should be given all of the respect do because he is a friend of peace and order.
So this is a letter that Lord Selkirk wrote.
To
Yes.
Peguis.
And what did Peguis do with the letter?
He kept it.
He was to carry it. He was to carry it
It
around.
was a letter of introduction.
Like to show
It was
to
a letter
people?
of introduction to the Hudson's Bay Company.
If he ever had any difficulty, all he had to do was show it, and because Lord Selkirk was a majority shareholder in the Hudson's Bay Company, he would be given all of the respect and consideration. I don't think he ever had to use the letter in that regard, but this thing, the statement that he should be given all of the respect due of all friends of peace and order.
Yep.
That really is telling about what this man was. He was truly a man, a friend of peace and order.
Yep.
We've learned a lot about the character of Chief Peguis. What about the character of Lord Selkirk himself? Was there something about him that
goodness.
led him to be able to develop and foster this relationship?
Well, we got to remember Selkirk was a very young man, comparatively speaking. I think he was 30 or something like that.
In his 30s, yeah.
And he wasn't due to inherit the title and the wealth that he did inherit. And when he did, he wasn't a spendthrift. He was a philanthropist. He saw the difficulty of his own people in the Highlands, and he wanted to do something for them. This settlement was not the first one. He had settlements in your part of the world, in PEI.
My family's descended from the
there you
settlers
go.
that arrived at PEI in 1803.
Yeah, and then he had settlements in Ontario, and then this was, I think, the third one, at least the third one.
But Selkirk also was educated, if I understand it right, during the Scottish Enlightenment.
Yeah.
He went to Paris after the French Revolution to speak to Robespierre, to try to find out how that worked.
Came
what
back
went
with
on.
his head, that's good.
And he was a great opponent of slavery. In fact, he was a supporter of William Wilberforce, who led the fight against slavery. So these two progressive, brilliant men found this like-minded purpose in what they did here.
Yeah, absolutely.
That's very true.
Why do you want all Manitobans to know the story of the Selkirk Treaty?
I think there's two reasons. One, it's a great story. It's a marvelous story. And it really speaks to the second part, to what we're trying to do today in the era of reconciliation. Trying to reconcile the differences or the hurt that exists between today's Aboriginal community and the non-Aboriginal community or Indigenous community. And this is a story of is a great example of what individuals can achieve if they sit down with goodwill. And I think that it's a story worth telling. I think that we can learn from it. It's a fun story too. I mean, when you look at the history and you read the contemporary letters and articles in newspapers of the day following the Selkirk Treaty and the Treaty Number 1, you find language in there that's not very political today, but that's what was used in the day. And it's fascinating. The skullduggery and the politics that was played, it's just entertaining.
And John, why do you care so much about the story of the Selkirk Treaty?
Well, I care because it is, as Bill says, it's an important part of our unique history in Manitoba. And more than that, though, Canada is a country mostly of settler stock, people who have immigrated from everywhere in the world, and we've come here under the rule of law, in the context of British institutions, under a monarch, and we are all bound by that culture. And the Royal Proclamation that we referred to earlier was a proclamation of King George III. Well, the present Queen of Canada is in the same line as King George III. So the crown is the same crown that it was then, and we are all bound to under the rule of law, to respect the law and to respect what commitments have been made. And so I think that for the non-Aboriginal community, we need to face up to the fact that these were solemn commitments that were made by the Crown to Indigenous people, and we must honor those commitments. And we've obviously in the past the country has fallen down very badly in honoring those commitments, or some of them at least, and we've got to get that right. And so people who aren't Aboriginal need to understand this. This is something that is very, very fundamental to the nature of this country and to the rule of law, and we all need to get on board.
John Perrin, thank you. Bill Shead, thank you.
Thank you, Terry.
Thank you, Terry.